Hey everybody, this is Chris coming to you with another group overview for the week heading into November 4th. So October is behind us. It was a busy month, and we are going to continue this week with our study of the Kings and the King. And this week we will be looking at the topic, Is Judgment Coming? Focusing specifically on 2 Kings 8 through 10. As we continue our study through Kings, we've worked through quite a few years of history in the nation of Israel, and we're seeing some of the accompanying history for Judah. And this week we begin to focus in on chapters 8 through 10. And specifically, we're going to look at the rise and fall of several kings, but most importantly, we're going to look at how God judges the family of Omri through Jehu, a king that he raises up for an instrument of justice. And as we look at this, you're going to see several items here that kind of summarize chapters 8 and 10. And so as we focus in on the questions that will be leading our groups in this coming week, quickly summarize what's happening in 8 and 10. And you can use these bullet points, which are included in your notes, to kind of help give a sense of what's happening here. But again, we will focus specifically on what's happening with Jehu as he is commissioned by a prophet, not Elisha, and he is used as an instrument of God's judgment against the house of Omri. Now, Omri, you'd have to go back into 1 Kings to find where he is brought under judgment. And most notably, as we've been studying, it would be through his son Ahab and his evil wife Jezebel that brought the judgment of God upon them. And so we're going to see the conclusion of that chapter. Ahab is already dead, and Jehu will now go and execute the remainder of Ahab's family, including his evil wife Jezebel. And so that's what you're going to be focusing on in this week's text, and it's really going to give us an underscore of God's judgment upon this evil king and his evil wife. Secondly, we're going to look at the final assessment of Jehu, and that's found in the last few verses of chapter 10. And it's interesting that he seems to be a person that has kind of a mixed blessing, if I can use that word. While he's zealous for the Lord, he continued to worship the 2 calves that were set up by Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. And so there's some lessons that we can learn from the life of Jehu, because I think that in some ways describes a lot of people who are zealous for the Lord outwardly, but inwardly their heart of worship really displays their true self. And we'll study that in our notes a little bit more this week. And then finally, as we're looking at the text, we're going to look at why do you think people ignore warnings of God's impending judgment? And I argue that it really has to do with the hardening of our heart, that as we continue on in sin, sin hardens our heart. And we see this specifically in Hebrews 3:13, where it says that we are hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. And then specifically, we will look at Romans 1, in which God gives us over to the sinful desires of our heart in what theologians often refer to as the judgment of abandonment. And so as we look at this, we have to keep in mind that we are focusing here not on the Christian. So as a Christian, we would say that, our security, our salvation is secure, and that there is nothing we can do that would separate us from the love of God. But when we look at the world in general, the unrepentant world, God's mercy has a limit. And we see that in this week's text when God reaches his limit and brings judgment upon the house of Omri. And we see that in our own lives of those around us who seem to walk in complete arrogance and pride as they ignore the warnings of God's impending judgment, and yet they continue on in their sinfulness. And so I argue that the reason we do that as people is because sin hardens our heart. And so that's kind of the focus of how we will look at this week's text from 2 Kings. The take-home truth this week is when you see God's judgment delayed, Don't jump to denying it, but instead see his patience on display. And as we have done for the last several weeks during our study of Kings, we will also then look at some applications to America today through the lens of a book by Erwin Lutzer, The Church in Babylon, Be a Light in the Darkness. And this week we will look specifically at the role of immigration in our country. And this is really a hot topic right now as we head into the November 2018 elections. And specifically, I want to touch on how Islam brings a dark side to the whole topic of immigration. And that's really the focus of what Lutzer highlights in his book and in this chapter. And then wrestle with what is the church's role in this whole issue. There's a lot of dialogue out there about how Christians should respond to immigration. And so it's important that we understand clearly the role of government versus the role of the church. And so some of the things that we will look at in this week is trying to define the role of government and how that differs from the role of church. And specifically, we'll look at the responsibilities the Constitution of the United States gives to government, which is, if I was just to summarize it in a couple words, it's to protect and defend our borders and to ensure the safety and well-being of its people. And that is a historic role of governments in general, not just the United States. And that's very different from the church. The church has a different mission than protecting its people. And so we need to try to understand that and not let the church become embroiled in the things that the government should be doing, but at the same time doing the things that the church should be doing. And then we're going to look at why the issue of immigration is such a hotbed issue in our country today. And I argue that really what we are seeing is played out in front of us with the issue of immigration, the battle between globalism and nationalism. Now, nationalism has taken a kind of a slant over the last 2 years as people have tried to paint that as some kind of racist or white supremacist type thing. But by nationalism, what we really mean in a historic sense is a right to national sovereignty, that countries have a right to govern themselves. And this is particularly true in the United States. And so what we see is being played out, this battle between those who believe that the best path forward for the world is a global government, one in which nations really submit themselves to this global government. And immigration plays right into this whole battle. In order for the United States to be part of a global community that is governed by some global organization, it has to be diminished. It can no longer be the shining light of national sovereignty that is held up, but one in which we look at ourselves as a part of a global community. And that is a huge paradigm shift. And I think we're seeing that played out right now in a lot of different countries, not just the United States. The recent Brexit vote was a pushback against the global aspirations of the European Union by the British voters who look upon the United Kingdom as a sovereign country, and they don't want to submit their sovereignty to the European Union. So we are seeing this played out in a lot of places, and specifically here in America, the issue of immigration brings this up. Now, we also want to look at the role of Islam, because Islam brings a dark and sinister side to immigration. This is something that, as you will see in the notes and as Erwin Lutzer explains in his book, we oftentimes focus on terrorism when it comes to the threat from Islam. But in truth, the real threat to nations in the Western world is not one of terrorism, but it's through immigration. It's a demographic battle, and we are seeing several countries in Europe today that are losing this battle. And we are even starting to see places in the United States where this is becoming an issue. Places like Dearborn, Michigan and Minneapolis, Minnesota that are seeing large amounts of Muslims move in, and as they take over through the democratic process, they're able to change laws and to begin to mold the culture into ways that are complementary to Islam. And so the threat from Islam is a practiced threat. It's not something that's happening by mistake. This is a long-term approach to what Islam ultimately is desiring, which is to be the dominant religion in the world. And so this is the darker, more sinister side, because at the same time, there is strong evidence, and Lutzer highlights in this book, that the evil forces behind a lot of this do not mean well for America. They are not looking at this as a way to improve relations between an Islamic country and the United States. Organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood have been all but designated as terrorist organizations, and they operate with complete freedom within the United States, and they do have evil intents. And you will see this in the notes this week as Lutzer brings out some of the evidence that has been brought forth over the last 15 years of the Muslim Brotherhood's efforts to change America. And so that is the kind of the, I'm going to say, difficult aspect of this lesson, is dealing with some of these issues involving immigration and Islam. As we look specifically, how should the church respond to immigration? And wow, this is a tough question to answer in some ways, because I think, as we will underscore in the notes, the church has a very different responsibility than the government. And so, as Lutzer underscores in his book, the government's role is to defend the borders, to protect its people. But the church's role specifically is to be a welcoming committee to immigrants that land within our communities. And that's a very different perspective. And so as a church, we have to wrestle with what that looks like. And specifically, there's some challenges that are confronting churches today as we deal with immigrant families who are here illegally. This is a really tough question. In fact, I included a link to John Piper answering a similar question, and honestly, you can tell he's struggling to come up with a right answer, because there probably is not a right answer, and so each church is going to have to deal with this on its own. But this is something that would probably bring about some good discussion as you wrestle with the church's role, but just be very gracious in how people respond, and remind them that this is a difficult topic, and that it's one that a lot of us we don't have a right answer to it right now. And so we need to lead with a lot of grace and empathy as we move forward in this time. And then lastly, how do you think First Family could minister to immigrants moving to central Iowa? And yes, we may not see a lot of immigrants in Ankeny, but there are a lot of immigrants moving to central Iowa. And we've had some opportunities to minister specifically to the River Hills apartment complex a couple of years ago. And it is talk about a cultural shift to walk into these apartments and knock on the door and find yourself visiting with a 5 or 6 year old child who is interpreting for their parent who doesn't speak any English. That's right here in Des Moines. The nations are coming to us, and as Lutzer underscores in his book, and I thought this was pretty convicting, it is a lot easier to talk to your church about sending missionaries to a closed country than going to their own neighborhoods and talking to immigrants within their own community. And so that should convict all of us. And so as a group, how could our church have a role in welcoming immigrants to central Iowa and making their transition here friendly and easygoing? And that transitions, of course, into a time of prayer. And specifically this week, I think we need to pray for our political leaders. We need to pray for these elections coming up. This is an extremely divisive time within our country, and I don't think things are going to get better. I think as you continue to see what is happening, we are heading into some difficult times in the years ahead. One thing we know is that a house divided cannot stand. And right now, the United States is a house divided. And so we need to be praying for our political leaders of all persuasions. We need to pray that the church will have the right voice in this culture today, not a voice in which we seek to run and hide, but we can speak with wisdom and with love and with honor to those who are really struggling with where this country is at right today. And again, that's people on both sides of the political aisle. And then as we just, again, focus on what we can do as a church to be involved with the immigrants within our community and how we could be part of welcoming those. Real quickly, just to look at the month ahead, we have our fireside chats coming up the next couple weeks, starting this Sunday night at 5 p.m. And again, these are church-wide. They'll be held in the worship center. It's up to each of you as a group how you will handle this, whether you will encourage your group to come together or whether you'll just leave it up to folks individually to go. But here's the dates and times: November 4th at 5 p.m., Thursday, November 8th at 6:30, and Tuesday, November 13th at 6:30. And then coming up Thanksgiving week, we have another Fresh Encounter prayer service at 5 p.m. on November 18th. And then the week of Thanksgiving, of course, there will be no groups. And that takes us up to the 1st of December, believe it or not. Well, that's a look at group ministry this week. Again, I love you guys, and I thank you for your service. And wow, it was so good to see so many of you participating in the international dinner, and we had a great time with that. And I just want to thank you for the involvement that you showed over the course of our mobilization conference. Thanks so much, and have a great week.